Hello and a very warm welcome to our webinar Agenda Action Plan for the new Global Framework on Chemicals. My name is Mino Hemati and I'm happy to be moderating this webinar today for you. I'm a co-founder and associate of the MSP Institute, Multi-Stakeholder Processes for Sustainable Development. The MSP Institute is a small charitable association based in Berlin, Germany, and we're dedicated to supporting high-quality dialogue and collaboration among stakeholders, stakeholder participation, and good governance. And for us, this has a lot to do with gender as well. We've been working on gender and chemicals since 2017 with support from the German Federal Environment Ministry. And we've been active in the SAICM process, now the new Global Framework on Chemicals, since 2017. We're very happy to be organizing and co-hosting this webinar together with Maria Eugenia González Anaya from Mexico, who will also be speaking today. So it's a co-hosted event. In September, the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management, SAICM 5, convened in Bonn, Germany, and adopted the new Global Framework on Chemicals, GFC, formerly SAICM, which now includes gender equality as a principle of the new framework. In addition, a gender resolution was adopted, which requests the Secretariat, with the participation of interested stakeholders, to develop a gender action plan for consideration by the conference at its next session, the 6th session in 2026, to advance towards full, equal, and meaningful participation by all women in decision-making, and to promote gender-responsive policies and mainstreaming agenda perspective in the implementation of the framework. We are very happy about these historic steps towards gender-responsive chemicals management and want to use the momentum of such significant support for gender issues to discuss the next steps and the implementation of these decisions. In this webinar today, speakers will present the SAICM 5 decisions on gender and SAICM's previous frameworks' gender activities to date, provide examples of gender action plans in other international environmental policy processes, and discuss with you all the first ideas for the structure and activities elements of a future gender action plan for the global framework on chemicals. You've noticed probably that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online on our webpage and our YouTube channel. If you don't want to be seen in the video, please make sure you turn off your camera. Otherwise, we appreciate it if you have your camera on and we have a bit of a feel of being together in this virtual room. We will send you the link to the recording in the coming days. And this is the agenda of our webinar. We do have a broad and mixed audience today, as I said, thanks to all our friends and partners who have forwarded the invitation to their various networks. And we have including colleagues who may not be familiar with gender and chemicals issues or the UN processes on chemicals. And that's why we're going to start with a very brief introduction on the context of this webinar by my colleague Anna Holthaus in a minute. Then we welcome a first presentation by Pierre Quiblier from the GFC Secretariat on the outcomes of the recent 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management and on the gender activities under the previous SAICM. We will then hear Sasha Gabizon from Women Engaged for a Common Future, who will introduce gender action plans in other environmental policy processes for us to learn from. And the third presentation will be held by our co-host, Maria Eugenia González Anaya from Mexico. She will talk about the SAICM 5 resolution on gender and what it is saying in detail on a future gender action plan for the new framework. We'll hear these three presentations and then have some time for Q&A with you all. And before we close today, we want to brainstorm with you all a little bit about this future gender action plan and what it could look like. And we'll use a virtual mural board for that purpose, for you to leave your notes and questions and comments that will be enriching the discussion. So with that, let's get started. Over to my colleague Anna for a very brief overview of the context of this webinar. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Mino. Yes, to set the context of this webinar, I will very briefly introduce you to the linkages of gender and chemicals and the current chemicals policy processes at the international level. So we at the MSP Institute distinguish between three main dimensions why gender and chemicals matters. First, biological impacts, because women's and men's bodies are affected differently by certain chemicals, and so exposure, risk, and impacts can be different between the sexes. Secondly, chemical exposure is also influenced by various social gender aspects, and women and men are affected differently because of their gendered roles in society, especially due to the division of labor. And so men are, for example, more likely to work in construction and thus come into contact with chemicals from building materials, while on the other hand, women are more likely to work in the care sector and in contact with cleaning or care products. And in addition, due to gender roles, women and men tend to use different chemical products. And third is the potential of the gender analysis. The gender perspective allows us to understand the causes of unsustainable behavior in dealing with chemicals and helps us to find new solutions for more effective and sustainable chemical management. For example, personal protective equipment is often designed for the Western male body and simply does not fit women well and properly. And gender roles of masculinity, on the other hand, hinders women to take protective measures. And taking these gender aspects into account can increase safety when handling with chemicals. And these interlinkages of gender and chemicals also get increasingly more attention at the international chemicals policy level. Here you can see an overview slide of the current relevant policy processes. And our focus today is on the new global framework on chemicals, which has just been adopted at the SAICM 5 conference, as the previous framework, SAICM, which was adopted in 2006, expired in 2020. And this new framework is a voluntary platform with a broad scope, especially life cycle of almost all chemicals, including products and waste. In addition, the GFC also deals with capacity building, financing, and issues of concern, and we will hear more about that from Pierre later. And the SAICM 5 conference also adopted a resolution on gender. We will hear more about it from Maria, which includes the development of a gender action plan to be adopted at the next conference, the SAICM 6. Then there are several legally binding conventions dealing with specific chemicals or specific issues of chemicals management, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, and the Minamata Convention specialized on mercury. And the BRS conventions have a gender action plan since 2013, and it was updated this year. And we will hear more about that from Sasha. And the Minamata Convention has a brand new gender action plan adopted this year at the beginning of November. In addition, 2 new political institutions for international chemicals policy are currently being negotiated. One is the Plastic Treaty, a legally binding agreement planned for 2024, which is intended to deal with the entire life cycle of plastics. And the second is the new Science Policy Panel, an advisory body similar to the IPCC on climate change or EPBES on biodiversity. And it is planned for the end of 2024 and aims to provide scientific expertise and advice to political decision makers on chemicals, waste and pollution. And in both processes, the Women's Major Group is actively involved and advocating for the integration of gender equality. Yeah, I hope this gives a very brief overview. And with that, I hand over to Mino.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for this brief overview. And by the way, we will make sure that we share the presentation and including this table, which might be of interest for some, when we send along the link to the recording of this webinar as well. Now, I'm wondering if we have Pierre here. If not, I know that Delfina will step in to give his presentation. Delfina, what do you think?
Yes, of course.
Yes,
Can you see
will.
me?
Yes, we can see you. Now,
Okay, great.
Delfina, you will talk about the ICCM5 results and the gender aspects, and also what the previously SAICM Secretariat called SAICM Secretariat did on gender already. What I don't have is a proper picture of you and a good introduction about you. I just know that you're a lovely colleague at the SAICM GFC Secretariat, and I know that you were a very successful sports person too. But if I may ask you to maybe in a sentence or two introduce yourself before you take over Pierre's presentation, that would be very kind. Over to you, Delfina.
Great, thank you, Minu. Okay, so yes, I'll do a brief introduction of myself, and then I'll deliver the presentation and can gladly answer any questions once we're done with the initial part of the agenda. My name is Delfina Kuglivan. I've worked for the SAICM Secretariat since 2019 in many different roles. I'm currently working with the GFC and its transition. My main role in the Secretariat was the project management of the SAICM JEST project on emerging policy issues, where many of these gender activities have been taking place. And at the same time, I'm also the gender focal point for the branch, the Chemicals and Health branch in UNEP. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of my background. I also do many other things, but I believe those are the main relevant for the webinar today. So with that in mind, I will quickly deliver the presentation. And Anna, if it's okay, I'll tell you when to pass the slide because I don't have control. I hope that's okay with you. So as Anna mentioned, the Global Framework on Chemicals, a planet free of harm from chemicals and waste, was adopted in September during ICCM5. Can you please put the next slide? Thank you. This is just a snapshot of some of the media outlets that came out communicating the news of the new framework. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. And then, okay, so very briefly on the framework, Anna already explained, but the framework has three parts of it. It's the Global Framework on Chemicals, and then the Bonn Declaration, with that echoed the collective commitment and the shared goal of a planet devoid of the adverse impacts of chemicals and waste. And then the Global Framework on Chemicals Fund, and a set of resolutions dedicated to implementing the transformative framework. So we can divide the framework into three sections, or the outcomes of ICCM5. Next slide, please. The framework covers the life cycle of chemicals, including in products and waste. And it promotes initiatives to enhance the sound management of chemicals and waste, and takes also due account of other chemicals and waste instruments and MEAs that have been developed to date. And it is flexible enough to take into account that other new instruments that might come in play in the coming years. Next slide, please. The framework is divided into 5 strategic objectives. The first objective speaks about legal frameworks, institutional mechanisms, and capacities that should be taking place. The second objective speaks about comprehensive and sufficient knowledge and data and information that are generated and, most importantly, available and accessible. The third objective speaks about issues of concern and those should be identified, prioritized, and addressed. The fourth objective speaks about safe, alternative, and innovative and sustainable solutions, specifically dedicated to products in value chains. And the last objective talks about enhancing of implementation and effective resource mobilization, including through partnership, cooperation, as well as capacity building. Next slide, please. So within the framework and under each of the strategic objectives, we have 28 agreed targets that need to be achieved between some of them in 2030 and some of them by 2035. These targets wave from shaping legal frameworks and enhancing institutional mechanisms to foster safer and alternatives and innovative solutions within products value chains. Here are a few examples of the targets that are relevant. In general, I think those are the ones that I could say are the most innovative and the most interesting in relation to the new work that will be happening within the Secretariat. But I wanted to, next slide please, also speak about the gender implications and gender mentions in the GFC. So GFC recognizes the risk that chemicals and waste pose to vulnerable groups, such as children, women, and indigenous communities. And it emphasizes the protective measures tailored to these populations. In its core framework text, in its principles and approaches, the framework underlines gender equality as a critical aspect for its implementation and advocates for women's full and equal participation and leadership in all related decision-making processes, which is great news to have it there in the principles and approaches. We also have a target B5, which focuses on developing educational programs that are sensitive to gender-specific needs and roles in chemical safety. Additionally, there is an activity in the program of work for the Secretariat that goes from 2024 to 2026 that calls for the development of a gender action plan in line with resolution 5.4 and 10.4, sorry, and 5.4, yeah, and report to the next conference, which is still TBC, but it probably would happen in 2025 or 2026. And then in pursuant of this decision, the Secretariat will develop and coordinate a participatory process to develop a gender action plan to be submitted for consideration on the next conference. So there's some actionable items within our program of work that will be directly devoted to the development of this gender action plan. The details will be sorted out as time passes, but that is within our program of work, and that's that's a great way forward in terms of moving in this direction. And then finally, there's also a resolution talking about mainstreaming a gender perspectives and promoting gender equality and empowerment of women and girls in chemicals and waste management, which intends to support the Secretariat in its efforts to mainstream gender in all activities to be undertaken by us, Secretariat, and by, importantly, all of the GFC stakeholders. This will be further spoken by Maria Eugenia, so I'll leave it at that. But yeah, there's 4 main parts of the GFC outcomes that that are directly speaking about gender or speaking to gender. So next slide, please. So recalling the SAICM previous work on gender, well, initially, it's important to state that the incorporation of gender considerations into MEAs and environmental agreements, including Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Minamata, have also always been an increasingly priority for UNEP. So that has been something that we have been rolling out for many years within the Secretariat and working internally within UNEP to incorporate all of these gender considerations. Within the SAICM Secretariat and its activities, we did a partnership between UNEP and the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or also known as IPEN, to work on gender and chemicals, in particular on raising awareness, promoting women's engagement and leadership in decision-making processes, and as well as continuing to activities related specifically to the SAICM emerging policy issues and the SDGs. With this in mind, we did 2 main publications also in partnership with IPEN, and as part of the SAICM Jeff project on global best practices on emerging policy issues. The first publication was in 2020, and it was a gender review across the current EPIs and other issues of concern. And the second publication was also published by IPEN in 2022 and showcased women leader stories working at different levels to strengthen protections against harmful chemicals. And the publications of these two reports were followed by the organization of webinars to discuss further on follow-up actions. So those ones were also organized, and we actually had a quite nice turnout, which means that the publications were very welcomed and found useful. And additionally, the project also established 4 communities of practice, and one of them being on chemicals and SDGs. Within these discussions in the communities of practice, multiple sessions since 2020 discussed issues related to gender and the self-management of chemicals and waste, as well as gender-specific considerations related to EPIs. So we did some work within SAICM regarding gender, but next slide, please. If I could mainly go into a little bit of lessons learned that we came up after doing all of these activities, is that the inclusion of gender considerations in project development is of extreme importance, and the importance to collect and develop gender disaggregated data for policymaking is also something that needs to keep going and moving, and the importance also of continuous monitoring and evaluation to be able to adapt and refine the gender mainstreaming strategies. So those, I could say, are the main points that were learned from our previous work with gender. And then with this in mind, there are future opportunities for gender mainstreaming within the GFC. We have the opportunity to develop a gender action plan that aligns with the resolution, and also integrates measurable goals for gender equality in chemical management. Also, the GFC opens a possibility for capacity building that brings opportunities to develop and implement gender responsive educational training and public awareness programs by 2030, which is speaking directly to target B5. And also allows for the possibility to enhance women's knowledge and leadership in chemical safety and sustainability. And finally, there is an opportunity to further enhance collaboration with MEAs, secretariats, and UN entities like UN Women, UNHCR, to foster gender equality within the framework's implementation, and to also impose stakeholders to detail gender mainstreaming efforts in their reporting to promote transparency and accountability. So with this in mind, I would like to conclude my presentation now. I think that the snapshot of what the information I've given provides an overview of what is to come, but I also think there's a lot of work that needs to start happening. We need to get in the ground and rolling in order to be able to advance with these activities and really start working on what was said in GFC and not lose the momentum. So thank you very much for the time to present.
Thank you very much, Delfina, for this overview of what's come out of the ICCM 5, what's been done before, and also the lessons learned, and then in the end the future work, which is quite a bit, but it's also opportunities, of course, for everybody to engage, as this is the multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral process. Thanks very much for spontaneously stepping in to do the presentation. That's a very cool feat. Thanks very much. And I see, Pierre, that you've been able to join. Welcome to Pierre as well. And we'll have a Q&A later on after the presentations. And Pierre, if you can stay, then maybe Delfina and you can both answer questions. So thanks again, Delfina, for stepping in. Cool team in Geneva. I'd like to go to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Sasha Gabizon, and you're sharing your screen in a second yourself, Sasha. Sasha is the International Director of Women Engaged for a Common Future, an eco-feminist network working in 50 countries on gender-just sustainable development. For WECF, Sasha co-organized the Women's Major Group at the UN for many years and helped the creation of the Women and Gender constituencies in other UN conventions, such as the on Chemicals and Waste, the BRS conventions, and on climate change in the UN FCCC process. Currently, Sasha is focusing on WECF's programs on strengthening eco-feminist movements, gender transformative climate finance, feminist foreign policy, and gender dimensions of chemicals and waste and plastic waste. Welcome, Sasha. You've been working for decades in international environmental policy processes where gender action plans are used as central instruments for gender mainstreaming. We're happy to have you here and learn more from your experiences with gender action plans. Sasha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Minou. I hope you can all hear me well. Thank you also, Maru and Anna. And before I start, I just want to honor the fact that we have a lot of fantastic experts on gender and chemicals and environmental issues on our call. I see Eva, Helen, Jeanette, many of you who are here, Tripti, of course, Nita. So really looking forward also to the discussion with you, because I think all of you have a lot of experience. But I have been specifically asked to share some lessons learned and some reflections on what we know and have learned from other processes, multilateral environmental processes, specifically on gender action policies and plans. So I'll do that in the coming 10 minutes. And if I go over time, please let me know, Anna. Great. So I wanted to share with you some lessons from the Global Environment Fund. I don't know if we have anyone on the call here with us from the Global Environment Fund. If yes, then please let us know. The climate conventions, the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Green Climate Fund, which goes with the Climate Convention, the Adaptation Fund, which goes with the Climate Convention, and last but not least, the Basel and Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. Let me start with the Global Environment Fund, because we had a really interesting presentation at the last BRS COPs by Verona Colantes, who leads the gender work there now. And she explained why it is so important to, of course, have, first of all, an overall gender policy, which sets the stage. Yeah, so if you look at their policy, it really aims at having gender responsive approaches for all the projects they fund, where they see women and feminist organizations not only as beneficiaries, but also as partners, as possible implementing partners. And also that the policy wants to address barriers, underlying barriers, and that they set binding minimum criteria for gender equality in project design. And that all projects, 100%, need to have a gender analysis or assessment. If not, they cannot be funded. But also that internally in their own organization, they are doing a lot of work on strengthening leadership, on gender equality, have gender specialists, have specific experts, and also that they want to be able to support implementing agencies, member states, but also engage with experts on civil society on the gender equality dimensions of the projects which they fund. And I'll just give one example, which I do like this, yes, which was mentioned by Verona, which is their Islands program, which has a specific own gender equality action plan. It has capacity building and training, so education, so also similar to what we would like to do with the global framework on chemicals. And it has created a community of practitioners who are implementing gender equality in their program on sustainable low and non-chemical development in small island states. So these are really interesting examples I think we can already look at when we think about developing a gender action plan for the global framework on chemicals. Now on the UNFCCC, we have been working the last 3 years already on the implementation of the second gender action plan. So we have already quite some experience with the gender action plan of the UNFCCC. This one has the following 5 key areas, priority areas on capacity building, on gender balance in the negotiations, in the delegations, but also on, for example, bodies and boards, on coherence between the different parts of the convention, on gender equality, and very much also on how then to implement gender responsively the convention at national level, and how to find the funding to do that, which is meant with means of implementation, which includes the funding. And then, of course, also, how do you report back? What are your key indicators, and how do member states report on this? And one interesting thing in the reporting, the Secretariat also reports every year on how many women and men are in the delegations, and not only how many are in the delegations, but also how much speaking time they take. And that is really interesting because it's a qualitative indicator. And it shows that even though we have increased the number of, we have increased the gender balance in the delegations, there's still much more time being taken to speak by the male colleagues than by the female colleagues. So very interesting lessons. We can come back to that in the discussion. I also wanted to mention the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have had a lot of focus on their gender work the last 2 years, and they have just adopted as one of the key targets for this legally binding convention under the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Target 23, which is specifically a standalone target on gender equality, which is really, really, really amazing that we got that. And that, as you can see from the screen, looks at the gender responsive approach where all women and girls have equal opportunities and capacities to contribute to the objectives of the convention, including recognizing their equal rights on access to land and natural resources and their full, equitable, meaningful, and informed participation and leadership at all levels of action, engagement, policy, and decision-making related to biodiversity. So it's a wonderful target. There has been a lot of negotiations on that. And there's also the Target 22 has a very strong gender dimensions, and the aim is now to make sure that all the targets from 1 to 23 have a gender dimension and an indicator, key indicators to measure them. And it also agreed to a gender action plan. And I wanted to highlight a few points which I really like from the Biodiversity Gender Action Plan is that, for example, they want to ensure meaningful and effective engagement and empowerment of women and girls from indigenous peoples and local communities. That's very strongly in that gender action plan. But also what I really like is that they say that they recognize the structural barriers and power imbalances that hamper inclusiveness and that hamper therefore also the implementation of the gender action plan itself. And that we need to address these power imbalances. And that therefore we need to take an intersectional approach where we prioritize the needs and interests of all women and girls, in particular those who are already facing multiple forms of discrimination. So I think we should learn from that for our plans for the global framework on chemicals. We need to have an intersectional approach. We need to understand that we are working with women and girls and non-binary persons who are facing multiple forms of discrimination because of class, race, sexuality, ability, age, gender, ethnicity, education, and culture. So that approach, I think, and to highlight that in our gender action plan is very important. Also, what is interesting on the Convention for Biodiversity, they like the one on climate. It has this annex with sets very clearly objectives, actions, deliverables, timelines, but also who should do that. And for the Convention on Biodiversity, they have 3 main outcome areas. For example, the first one is on having all women and girls having equal opportunities and capacity to contribute. And then within that objective, they have indicative actions, like, for example, supporting women's organizations and networks to have equal opportunities to lead and participate in decision-making around the convention, related to land and water, land tenure, property reforms, amongst others through consultations and in accordance with national law. That's always added by some of the member states. We don't like that very much. But what we do like, and the provision of financial support, because that's often where we have the problems, is that we have a great gender action plan, but then we don't have the access to funding to implement the planned actions of that gender action plan. Now, some of the conventions have their own financing mechanisms, like the Climate Convention has the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. That sounds very similar to the GFC, but it's not the same. It's the GCF, so the Green Climate Fund. And here it is mandatory that all accredited entities who are going to implement the climate projects which are funded by the Green Climate Fund, all accredited entities must undertake mandatory gender assessments and develop a gender-level gender action plan for their projects, including a gender budget. So the gender budgeting aspect is really important. And Manana, I see your hand up, and we are going to have a discussion, so we'll get back to you very soon. Great to see you, by the way. But so I think that's really good. There's this, mandatory aspect on the gender assessment. There's a mandatory aspect to have a budget for the implementation on the gender activities, and there is also responsibility for gender audits of the project. Now, despite that, we still know that we are really not doing well enough. Even for the GCF, we see that the design of the project is gender responsive, but often the implementation really is not gender responsive enough. So we have lessons to learn there as well. Now, the Adaptation Fund also has mandatory gender demands, and it has developed some really interesting tools like gender scorecards, gender guidance sheets, and a gender advisory group. So again, we can learn from that. Now I'm almost over my 10 minutes. I am over my 10 minutes, but I have only 2 slides left. The BRS conventions, we have there also a gender action plan which needs to be renewed. But there has been a lot of really interesting work because there was a lot of lack of understanding what the gender dimensions are of chemicals and waste, because it's often such a technical topic. So one of the things which has been done with support from the Secretariat and from Sweden is to do scoping studies, case studies, understand in specific situations what are the gender dimensions. For example, we have been working on several of them, including the last ones done in Kenya and Tunisia. And they also include documentary films to really show what does this mean, for example, for women and men and children who are waste pickers, informal waste pickers. How are they being affected by pollution from chemicals and from waste? And what type of policies do you need to address these specific vulnerabilities and challenges we see? So these are some of the really, as I say, excellent examples which many of you have been working on for already decades to get these mechanisms, to get these policies, to get these gender action plans, to get these case studies, to propose better policies. But still, we are not where we want to be. We have many challenges, and 2 I want to mention. One is indeed the finance aspect. For example, for the climate ones, we have created for each national delegation specific focal points, the gender and climate focal points, but they are not funded. It's almost impossible for them to get funding. Some are paying from their own pockets their participations in the negotiations on climate. That, of course, does not work. So that's one, that's the funding. And I think the other one is the indicators. So for example, for the Convention on Biodiversity, there's an ongoing negotiation how to formulate the indicators. And currently there is a proposal to have simplified indicators where you only have to tick yes or no as a government reporting. Have you involved women in your project design? Yes or no? And of course, that's not enough. We need much more quantified, gender disaggregated data. So I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sasha, for this overview and sharing a load of knowledge in very brief time. Thank you very much, Sasha. One thing that struck me, for sure, we are building on the shoulders of giants as we go into developing a gender action plan for the new global framework on chemicals, and there's so much that can be built on, including the lessons learned that you mentioned and the challenges that are surely going to be similar in this new framework. Thanks very much, Sasha. Our next speaker is Maria Eugenia González Anaya. Welcome, Maria. She is the first Secretary for Environment at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN office in Geneva, with over 17 years of professional experience in various sectors, including government, non-government organizations, and consulting. Maria, or Maru for her friends, was instrumental in initiating the gender resolution for ICCM5 and introduced and negotiated it at ICCM5. So she's probably the person who knows the gender resolution best in all its details and will now introduce it to us. Thanks very much for co-organizing and co-hosting this event today with us, Maru. And thanks for all your hard and successful work on this topic. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Minu, and for this presentation, and of course, thanking MSP Institute, Minu and Anna for inviting Mexico to co-host this conversation. For me also, it's an honor to share this space with my fellow panelists, Sasha I'm sorry that I
Delfina.
Delfina, to share this experience related to all the resolution on gender and chemicals, which was discussed during the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management 1 month ago, or a few months ago. Next slide, please. Well, before I start sharing all the results of the negotiation during ICCM5, I want to express our sincere appreciation to MSP Institute and all civil society organizations, intergovernmental organizations, unions, academia, as well as representative of their member states that were part of a small but collaborative group that decided to scale up efforts and draft such a resolution. So this was the first step on constructing this resolution. This was a very small group that started talking about it, and we had several meetings a few months before the ICCM5 meeting. And then we decided to start the presentation of this resolution among other regional groups. This was an approach that we start doing with the GRULAC region, as well as the African group and the EU. So we have very broad acceptance of the content of the resolution, and so we got 2 regions as co-sponsors of the resolution, and then we were able to present the resolution during the first day of the conference in Bonn. Well, additionally, this group put all their efforts to integrate the gender perspective, not only on the negotiations per se of the resolution, but also on the negotiations during other contact groups for the ministerial declaration, the global framework of chemicals. So this negotiation was part of the contact group on resolutions, the group of friends of the chair, and also the COW and informal groups. As results, we can say that we close the loop during the negotiations in order to have a gender perspective in all documents submitted for discussion during ICCM5. Next slide, please. Delphina already explained a little bit what were the results of all these documents that we presented during ICCM 5, but I would like to arrive to some of ones, because I'm telling you that we close the loop, because it's very important that from the ministerial declaration to the resolution, we have the gender perspective covered for the next steps that are very important to start working on. So the ministerial declaration recognizes the impact of chemicals on different groups, and chemicals often have impacts on human health, particularly on women and children. And this is very important. Gender equality can support the sound management of chemicals and waste. This is a very important part of the ministerial declaration. And we were able to negotiate. It was a very difficult negotiation in the Friends of the Chair group, but we were able to introduce this text on the declaration. Then we also have good results on the global framework on chemicals. We can say that the gender perspective was introduced on principles, and also we were able to have a few targets and also mentions of the perspective on the Annex B of the global framework on chemicals. So on principles, we were able to introduce text, so women are agents of change and are essential to addressing the issue of chemicals and waste. The framework advances gender equality through their full and equal participation and gender-inclusive approaches in all aspects of the implementation of the framework, including in decision-making. This is very important. So this principle has to apply for all the implementation of the framework. So the gender inclusive approach has to be taken into account on all the implementation of the new global framework on chemicals. Then we have specific targets, as you mentioned before, the target B5. So it's related to education, training, and public awareness programs, which must take into consideration a gender perspective approach. And also target B7, which relates to have monitoring and surveillance data and information disaggregated by sex. So this was a very important element to have disaggregated data in the global framework on chemicals. And finally, the Annex B contains all the declaration, resolution, instruments, guidelines, and multilateral agreements related to the gender perspective. So among the instruments that are mentioned in this annex, we can find the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also the General Assembly Resolution on the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And then finally, some points very important on the resolution. I have to say that after the first lecture of the resolution in the contact group of the resolution, this was a contact group that had to review 20 resolutions. And I'm very, very proud to tell you that the gender resolution was the first resolution that was approved in the contact group in the second lecture. Well, this was a very productive conversation with some delegations, we heard some of their views, their concerns, so we were able to accommodate their concerns and their views. We presented a new second review of the resolution, and I think that the results and the content of the objectives of the resolution are pretty much what we were looking for. First of all, to request the Secretariat to with the participation of interested stakeholders to develop a gender action plan. So this gender action plan has to be put in consideration by the conference in the next session. This was the most important part of the resolution. The second one is that the resolution encourages all the stakeholders to support interim actions towards the goals mentioned in mainstreaming a gender perspective. This could include the development of national gender action plans and other actions to promote gender equality and to create conditions for all women and girls to empower themselves in chemicals and waste management. And here, this is also very important because these interim actions also include the creation of multi-stakeholder partnerships, like the partnership of gender and chemicals that was just launched during the SAICM 5, and also the promotion of and the incorporation of gender-specific tools, gender disaggregated data collection methods, and research to better understand the links between gender, chemicals, and waste. And also the resolution contemplates that the Secretariat has to foster collaboration with other multilateral environmental agreements and relevant United Nations agencies and programs, including UN Women and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and all other relevant partners in the field of gender equality in relation to the implementation of the global framework on chemicals. And finally, the last objective of the resolution is that invites all stakeholders to include information on the progress made in mainstreaming a gender perspective in their reports to the conference. That means that meanwhile the gender action plan is approved in the next conference, all the stakeholders are able to make some progress in even mainstreaming gender or doing their national action plans among other activities. So the Secretariat can take all the information from them. The next slide, I think this is the last one. But well, I think just as reflection, I would like to say that this is this early exercise of discussions, deliberations around the CRP, the resolution that we as a group presented to the SAICM 5, is a great example and a lesson learned that we should replicate in future negotiations, not only the ones that are related to the chemicals that cluster that we are most familiar with, but also with the implementation and the elaboration of the gender action plans that we have ahead. And it's a good way to collaborate also with the Secretariat and with all other multi-stakeholders. So with this, I close my speech and remain open to any questions that you may have related to these negotiations. Thank you, Min.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maro, for this presentation and giving that overview. And as you said, to just explain how this sits together and how a loop was closed. And I also must say that the exercise of preparing this together and then having it the first one to be passed was exhilarating. I'd also say that when Maro introduced the resolution on the first day in plenary, it was the only introduction of a CRP that received applause, which was very uplifting to hear and see. So it seemed to me that there was a lot of positive and collaborative energy around these issues.
If may I jump in? This something that is very unprecedented was that this resolution obtained the co-sponsoring of 2 regional groups, and this is something that any project or any CRP in other multilateral negotiations has been possible to obtain. So this is a very good precedent, and I'm very glad that all this group was able to get that achievement.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And I think it was primarily your outreach that delivered that. So thank you very much. I would like to open for questions and comments, and we could take maybe 10 minutes or maybe a little more to answer questions that colleagues might have and comments that you would like to make. If you do have a question for a particular panelist, let us know. You can use the chat to pose questions or make comments, but you can also raise your hand. And we have a colleague, Manana, you've been raising your hand for a while. Thank you very much. And I'll certainly take you first. If you want to introduce yourself and go ahead, please, Manana. Not great. Come a little closer and try again. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Could you kindly type in the chat what you would like to say or ask? That would be great, because it's a little garbled. Thank you, Manana. Okay, I would look at the chat for questions and comments, and if you want to raise your hands, please go ahead and do so. There's a thank you from Sherika. Thank you for this. Then if I was asking, could you tell, are there some leading countries or giving good examples? Are there countries that are moving ahead or maybe regions or sub-regions where you would say they are leading in terms of developing and implementing gender action plans or any components of them? And I do look to Delfina, to Sasha, to Maro, also to Pierre, if you want to come in at this point. Question from Eva from Germany. Anybody would like to take that one? And Anna, if you could stop sharing, then I can easily see everybody. Thank you. Thanks. So if we have good examples, Sasha, would you like to share?
Yeah, so on gender in chemicals, of course, we have the national implementation plans of some of the conventions, like the Stockholm Convention, and we have had already quite a number of countries which have tried to integrate the gender dimensions into the national implementation plans. And we have seen some good examples or interesting examples there. Also in the case studies we helped do. And of course, it helps when countries have already a strong gender equality policy. Like in Kenya, for example, it's gender equality is in the constitution, and all ministries in the implementation of their national plans need to bring in gender dimensions, and they also need to make sure they have equal numbers or balanced numbers of different genders taking decisions. So that type of situation also helps already when you are looking at implementation of and chemical and waste policies. But of course, much more needs to be done, because I think there is still a lack of data in many cases, how women and men are differently impacted, but also how the solutions to try and reduce exposure to harmful chemicals doesn't equally benefit women and men. We see that because a lot of women are often in informal work and therefore are not automatically protected by some of the health insurance, for example, and also not visible in the national statistical data. That's one area, but also often because of a lack of understanding that there might be biologically different impacts from harmful chemicals. And therefore, what is interesting, for example, is that the Stockholm Convention does promote, for example, biomonitoring in breast milk, for example, of hazardous, some of the POPs, the persistent organic pollutants, so that you can create a databases, which then helps you to understand where do you have specific clusters of high pollution or certain groups of, for example, waste workers, which have much higher exposure to harmful chemicals, and that you need to take specific policy measures to protect them. So I think there's still a long way to go, but we have seen some very interesting examples. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for making several points that are very, very important to build on. Because I would agree that these examples of how this might work and where countries have made breakthroughs to look at how they achieve that is extremely important, so that we don't also have to learn the same lessons in various parts of the world over again. I see, Maro, that you have raised your hand, and I'm also looking at the chat. Thank you, Manana, for the remark. Sorry that your sound didn't work, but we'll get you the materials. Also, there's a question from Tiffany from Nike. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Mariela, but if you're still there, you might actually want to respond. Because Tiffany's saying from a high level, when you look at the manufacturing space where chemicals are used to make consumer products, how can brands and the chemical industry support this work so that we can gather or share meaningful data on impact chemical exposure has to human health and the environment? Maybe, Mariela, you would want to pick that one up, but it's also something I think interesting for the Secretariat. He is a stakeholder who probably has quite a few data and access to, and so the question is, how can such a stakeholder bring that in? Tiffany is nodding. Thank you very much. So if Mariela has unmuted herself, so I give you the floor, and then I probably go to Maro because you had raised your hand. Mariela.
Yeah, and thank you, Tiffany, for highlighting that. We actually had a conversation earlier this week as well around this topic, that ZDHC is an industry organization. So we do have a lot of stakeholders that are working on the ground actively with their supply chain, and also always gathering information within their supply chain of how chemicals are used, which chemicals are used, what the impact is of the chemicals, how the workers are dealing with those chemicals on the ground. And we do think that in line with the research and the data gathering that we might need to do under the partnership, the fact that there are industry organizations that are already gathering certain information can definitely help the implementation of the work that we want to do. So within ZDHC, we are going to invite the brands that are interested to, not only the brands, but also the suppliers and potential other stakeholders that are interested to look at how they can gather data and impact of chemical exposure to human health, not only in their own supply chains, but potentially thinking along of how in general it could be an example for other industries as well on how to gather data, and how our own tools could be part of that or not. So to really set up a plan together to see how we could explore that. But I do think indeed that it's also important to work with the Secretariat to see what, and that's one of the things that we discussed as well, what meaningful data will be in this case coming out of the industry, because we can collect a lot of different data. We know that it's there and that we are already doing it. But we need to look at certain additional data as well, or frame it in a different way. So there will be a follow-up, and I saw one or two other brands as well in the call. There will definitely be a follow-up also after talking to the Secretariat and to the other partners in the partnership to see how we could benefit from that data gathering and the transparency that we have in parts of the supply chain.
Thank you very much, Mariela, also for sharing that perspective and what's going on in terms of the conversations that you're having. I personally, I would say it's also extremely important to make that part of the process, so that, as you say, the data that are needed are actually being shared, and that there's a conversation about what is possible and what is necessary, and stakeholders engage in that and link that up so that it's a collaborative effort. I do now have on my list, and then they maybe should close it at some point. I have Maro, then Kwasi, then Helen, and then Pierre. If that's okay in that order, I'd call on you in that order. Maro.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to Sasha's intervention regarding the leading countries on examples. I have to say that there are countries with feminist foreign policy, and mainly countries from Latin American region, the Caribbean, Canada, EU countries, among others, that have good samples of gender responsive policies. But I want to add that we are experiencing also a backlash from other group of countries on this topic. And this is very important to mention, that we have to close groups to work further to confront these interventions from this group of countries. And finally, also, I want to add the importance of Sasha, and I think Delphina also mentioned, the means of implementation, the importance of resources to be able to elaborate gender action plans and to elaborate data. So this is very important also during the negotiations to take into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maro, for the experience. Also mentioning the backlash that I think we're all seeing, and underlining the need for the resources. It's all very nice to think up these things, but they need to be, it's an investment that is necessary, an investment in quality decision-making and quality implementation that is necessary. I see Kwasi, you raised your hand, and then I have Helen and Pierre. Kwasi.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Kazi from Bangladesh. Actually, we are working with the poor people, poor women and girls. But it was very interesting issue today, on chemicals with gender equality. I'm very impressed to hear today's discussion. But my question is, do you think that without economic empowerment, the gender equality or gender action plan will be possible? Because we are working with the poor people, so they need the economic empowerment. Otherwise, it is difficult to make the gender equality. So I just asking, my question is it possible? So without economic empowerment, the gender equality is possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazi. I would encourage subsequent speakers maybe to respond to that question. My personal immediate response would be no, and that starts with land rights and education and very different conditions that are needed for the informal sector, because that's primarily women, in order to achieve gender equality, but also then to achieve an acceptable situation with regard to chemicals. But I'm moderating, so I'm calling on Helen, who has the floor.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'll blur my background. Moving house, not a good look. Thank you all very much for your excellent presentations. I suppose I don't really engage on the international level much anymore due to lack of capacity, but also, yeah, you know, a big shout out for more online participation. But I'm really concerned about the way we approach different types of exposure. So it's very segregated into, you know, workplace exposures, environmental exposures, and consumer exposures. And I wonder, how can we ensure that the environmental organizations recognize the gender impacts from workplace exposure, and the occupational campaigners need to recognize the environmental impacts as well? Because there's kind of a triple jeopardy going on in terms of exposure, especially for women and those born female. So we have exposures in the home, in the workplace, and in the wider environment throughout the supply chain from production through to disposal. And I just wonder if anyone had anything, any suggestions how we could push this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen, for this remark and the question, and not to worry about your background. I give the floor on to Pierre. Maybe you also would like to respond to some of the questions that have been raised. Pierre, good to see you.
Yes, very good to see you. Can you hear me well? Yes, I suppose. Thank you. No, very good discussion, and thank you for all the good words, that have been expressed with regards to the adoption of the new framework, which I think offers a unique opportunity to mainstream and to reflect the importance of gender in the adequate management of our chemicals in the future. I think that there are some unique opportunities to be seized here, and in particular with regards to the implementation programs that have been highlighted within the framework, and particularly the shift that this framework is offering from a chemicals by chemicals type of focus to a much more strategic one, and to try to address the full life cycle of chemicals from its concept to its disposal. This is really the challenge that the framework is aiming at overcoming, and the focus on the industry and economic sectors is very important in mobilizing all the knowledge and all the possible actions in order to achieve the targets and the strategic objective of the framework. This is very important. And as we are going to design how best to address these industry economic sector focus within its programmatic activity, your input, the gender input, will be very important. Which sector needs to be, key sectors needs to be mobilized, how it is to be mobilized, what is the type of knowledge that we will need to gather in order to mobilize this sector, what are the best practices this sector can offer, what are the national legislations in order to make sure that all this is used. In other words, that nobody can give its responsibility to the neighbors, but every aspect, all responsibilities from all the actors are fully recognized, and that joint actions can take place. And in this exercise, the input of gender, the specificity that needs to be recognized, the specific exposure all along in designing the product, to disposing of the products, through its use, through its sales, through its export. All this, I would say, women have something to say all along these routes, and to make sure that this new focus that the new framework will offer will be addressed adequately, properly, and in a meaningful manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. As the current head of the Secretariat, I think we're pleased to hear that passionate commitment to the participation and also to working with the different sectors to make this concrete and successful. We feel invited to be participating. Thank you very much, Pierre. I said in the chat, I'm going to close the speakers list after Olga, because we wanted to do some brainstorming. So first, Olga, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minu, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for great presentations. And I'm a co-director of Health, Environment, Justice Support, and we also work a lot on gender issues. So, I heard very interesting reflections here from many of you, and I just wanted to add that women really are exposed to chemicals throughout their life, and also from different sources, and including at home. And this exposure at home should be really well recognized, because often it is like diluted or not well recognized. But at the same time, it's not only like cleaning products or medications that they deal with, it is also sanitary products. And I'm sorry, I forgot the name, but there was, Mariella Noto talking about transparency within the supply chain. And we also believe that transparency in products targeting women, including sanitary products, should be for the value chain, not only for the supply chain. At the moment, very unfortunately, women deal with these sanitary products like on their own risk, with no information whatever what they use. And there has been like multiple research or research data from, for example, India, where people use sanitary products a lot, and there are stockpiles, and there is no information about toxic chemicals in these sanitary products. So when we talk about transparency and traceability that we work on a lot, we should talk about transparency and traceability of chemical information in individual materials and products in the value chain and throughout the life cycle. This is the comment that I wanted to add. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olga. Yes, that transparency is extremely important, and then also not only listing, for example, what is contained in a product, but also sharing information of the potential risks associated with the substances that are being used. So there's that need for awareness raising and information sharing, not only the numbers and the long chemical names that are on the product, but also to be able to make an informed choice. Thank you very much, Olga, for adding that remark and highlighting this sector. I think we have 10 more minutes left. If people want to stay a little longer, of course, you're invited to do that. What we wanted to do, though, with you, now that we have the expertise of you all gathered here today, is to do a bit of brainstorming on how a future gender action plan of the new global framework on chemicals could or should look like. And Anna, Tadi, if you could put the link in the chat. There it is. Thank you, Tadi. There's a link to a mural board that we prepared. It's a virtual board. You don't need to download anything. You don't need an account to be able to use it. You can just enter as a visitor. Either you put in your name or not, just as you wish, and the random animal will be assigned to you. So there's nothing downloading to your computer or anything like that. If you click on that, you see that we prepared a virtual space with basically 3 questions, and the yellow squares are prepared virtual post-it notes that you can use to leave thoughts, suggestions, questions. And the 3 questions that we felt might be important to look at is, 1, on the left-hand side, what actions and activities should be listed in the future gender action plan? And we heard actually quite a few already. So what is it from your perspective that's most important in terms of actions and activities that should be part of the gender action plan? You might want to think about activities that could be done by your own organization or by your stakeholder group as well, or what others should be doing. Then there is a question on the structure of the gender action plan on the upper right-hand side. For example, which elements should this gender action plan include? Should it include a timeline by which action should be taken? Should it include who does what, like what Sasha was showing, I think, about the BRS, where it actually, and the Biodiversity Convention, where it actually says with specific actions on who should be doing what. and indicators to monitor progress. And then the third question is around your experiences with gender action plans, maybe adding to what Sasha has already shared. What are your experiences with gender action plans? Which ones are good to learn from? What maybe was difficult and shouldn't be repeated in this space because it didn't quite work? So what we wanted to do is to invite you to leave your thoughts, to contribute your suggestions on this board, if you wish. If you can't access the mural board, please be happy to share thoughts in the chat here and we'll copy it across. And because time is so limited today, Anna and I have been WhatsApping, and we think that we might just leave this open for a day or two and then summarize and share it with you all, whatever it is that you want to be contributing, together with the presentations and the link to the recordings. So we got the full whammy of everything that has been put together here today. So don't be shy if you have ideas or suggestions or questions with regard to the actions and activities that a gender action plan should include, the structure it should have, and maybe additional experiences that you've had with gender action plans. I say again, don't be shy. Just click on one of the prepared post-it notes, or you double click anywhere where you want to leave a remark and start typing. It's very easy to do. It takes a few seconds to refresh. I hope everybody can access this. If you have a problem, do let us know. And if you want to share, we're happy to gather those suggestions and thoughts. Okay, Manuel, you say you have a problem. I see what you're typing in the chat. If you want to leave something in the chat and we copy it over, happy to do that. Sometimes when there's quite a few people on a mural board, it takes a moment to digest, so to say, what you've been doing. But yeah, you can also leave it in the chat and we copy it across. Okay, there's quite a few thoughts that people are adding. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to look a little bit at what you're doing there. And yeah. Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah, don't mind typos, don't be worried to mess up anything on these boards. We can always clean it up, and the things that shouldn't be moved, I think, have been locked, so you can't destroy much. Yeah, I'll share the questions. Janet, you've asked for the questions. I'll share them here. But you have problems with accessing the board, just a sec. Or Anna, if you have them ready in front of you, also happy if you can share them. Just a sec, Janet is coming. And I'll add, Kazi, what you said to discuss with men and boys, I'll also add that. So, Anna, do you have the questions right there to copy? Oh yeah, there they're coming. Thank you.
I'm typing it in.
Yeah.
Yes.
The questions are coming in the chat. And so Janet and Nicolene, you said the mural is not opening for you. If you want to leave thoughts here, thank you, Tadi, also for the question. If you want to leave your thoughts or suggestions here in the chat, you're very welcome to do it. I think we're going to leave it open a little more. I'm going to close, but not really close the meeting, so that that you can leave your thoughts even if you can't access the mural. That be okay? Thanks. And then there's a third question. Thanks, Janet. Okay. All right. Yeah, shall we give ourselves a few more minutes? I do understand if people have to leave, of course, because we said we're going to go until 5:30. If you can stay a little longer, please do. Thanks, Johanna, for being here. And thanks to everybody who has to leave. Thank you very much for joining and sharing, listening, and thinking together. We'll make sure that we'll summarize what has been put on the board, as well as share the presentations and the recording. And hope to be in touch with you again to continue working on these issues, but maybe also collaborate on developing this gender action plan. As the Secretariat pointed out, this is going to be a consultative process that the Secretariat will convene, and maybe our webinar has helped a bit to gather the thoughts that we might want to put in there together. So yeah, let's stay a little longer if you can, and leave your suggestions and your thoughts and experiences here. And while you do that, I would like to thank speakers who have contributed to today's webinar, Delphina, and then also Pierre from the Secretariat, Sasha from WECF. Thank you for sharing those experiences from elsewhere, and Maru giving that overview of what has come together, but also a little bit on how it came together at the conference in Bonn, and what we have now in terms of gender-related outcomes and components of the new global framework on chemicals. And Anna for giving the context right in the beginning, for organizing and helping to set up this webinar, as well as Tatjana, both from our team here at MSP Institute. And one thing that wasn't on the agenda, but I'd like to use the opportunity to thank Anna in particular, because she's going to leave us for a few months, having better things to do. And we're very much looking forward to welcoming you back early next year, hopefully. Thank you very much, Anna, for all this work. We'll miss you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Olga.
Sorry, I just wanted to send a heart to Anna, but by occasion I just raised my hand. Sorry about that.
No need to be sorry. I think we all want to send a heart to Anna. Thanks very much, and we'll miss you, and we'll celebrate when you're back. Thank you. Thanks very much. So I'm wondering, we were not really closing, but maybe we are closing, as we should not go on for too long. So I'm just going to have a look at the mural board. Thank you very much. This is very rich. And in terms of what it needs to include, you got a lot that it needs to include, including a funding mechanism, and capacity building, training, exposure inventories, data, identification of sources of exposure. So there's the whole, maybe also the work along the life cycle, and then that's what the new framework is dedicated to. And it has to spell out along the whole life cycle. And I'm glad that you mentioned finance. And it's also mentioned in the structure part. How should the future gap be structured? You mentioned the finance issue. Without that, all of it is just talk. So thank you very much. Yeah, needs timelines. It should include tasks for all stakeholder groups, which I believe is very important and really requires a broad participatory process. Sasha.
Yeah, I put a lot on finance, but I want to highlight that we have a problem with finance because we know that we are in competition with finance needed for addressing climate change, with finance needed for addressing biodiversity loss, and often there is a competition. And so I think it's really important that we're looking at additional finance and that we're looking at innovative mechanisms, including polluter pays mechanisms. And that I think is something we might also still need more sharing of practices on, and yeah, looking more in detail at how can you get additional funding to do the work, the gender mainstreaming in the global framework that is necessary, from maybe also, you know, having a leverage, whatever it's called, a fee on certain groups of chemicals being used or so, or having new types of funding which come in when, you know, we have already existing polluters who are maybe not paying their full price. I think that aspect is really, really, really important, because if not, we're just going to be in competition with the other conventions, and that is not where I think we will be able to get all the funding. So we need to look at these other sources of funding. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, Sasha. Personally, I would definitely agree, and that kind of competition is not healthy. Quite the contrary. So two things come to mind for me. One is that it will be very useful to look at mechanisms that are being discussed elsewhere, and how people are advancing the work on extended producer responsibility, for example, in the plastics area, and others, so that we can learn from that. And secondly, in the process, in these 8 years between ICCM4 and ICCM5, quite a few suggestions were made in terms of generating the money that is needed. Not only the funding, but also the investment that is needed. And I think we shouldn't forget about those, but they've been part of the discussion, some of them with broad expertise behind it, some of them with studies behind them. And we should not put that aside and say, now we have the framework. No, we should build on that and keep considering it and see what we can do about it. It's that the funding question isn't over by having these beautiful targets and maybe a gender action plan, but quite the contrary. It must be at the top, because otherwise it is all for naught. So the money is the lifeblood of these actions, and it needs to be there. So thank you very much for focusing on that. And I think we have quite a few things in our hands actually that we can use to move forward. And it's a little maybe like gender. We have to keep at it. It's not going to be a fast process, and it's not going to be fast and radical agreements maybe, but we need to steadily work at it to change the situation. So thank you very much. With that, maybe we should try and close it for today. I think we have a task here of a very rich board that we're going to try and summarize for you to share it around, so that we can build on what has been pulled together here by everybody today, together with the presentations and the link to the recording. Thanks very much for sharing your time and contributing. And thanks very much to the speakers who prepared very informative, rich presentations and shared their knowledge and their questions and challenges. So thanks again. And let's close it for today. I hope you have a good evening, a good rest of the day, a good night, and hope to see you again very, very soon. Have a look at gender-chemicals.org if you're interested in what MSP Institute is doing on this. And if you're on that site, you can also find some information about the Gender and Chemicals Partnership that was launched in Bonn. And if you're interested in that one, we're certainly interested in talking to you. MSP Institute is the Secretariat of that budding multi-stakeholder partnership on these issues. So with that, thanks again and see you soon. Thanks very much.